This is the incredible story of Robert Anderson Hoover, the man who flew from war-torn Europe to freedom in a stolen German plane. In the sweltering August of 1922, Hoover was born into a working-class family in Tennessee. His father was a blacksmith, not a rich man, but rich in grit. And that grit would one day keep Robert alive over enemy skies. From the time he could walk, Robert's eyes were pulled upward to the planes buzzing over the fairgrounds. By age 16, he was hanging around Berry Field Airport, sweeping hangars, fetching tools, wiping oil off spark plugs. But he was learning, and by 1939, when war broke out in Europe, Robert Hoover knew he wanted to be a military pilot. The road to becoming a fighter pilot was long and hard, but Hoover persevered. And in early 1944, he found himself in Corsica flying a P-51 Mustang. But it was over the Mediterranean that Hoover's luck ran out. On February 9, 1944, while attacking a Nazi convoy off the coast of France, Hoover's plane was hit and he was forced to bail out. And that's when things got really interesting. Because once he landed in the water, German troops quickly surrounded him and took him prisoner. And soon he found himself in a German POW camp. But Hoover had a plan to escape, and it was audacious. Stay tuned to find out how he pulled it off. The gates of Stalag Luft I groaned open as Hoover was marched inside, soaked to the bone and shivering from his ditching in the Mediterranean. The cold air of northern Germany cut sharper than the February wind over France. This camp, nestled on the Baltic coast near the town of Bart, would be his home, if he let it. The compound stretched in bleak rows, wooden barracks, watchtowers bristling with armed guards, and coils of rusted barbed wire that seemed to hum with menace whenever the wind pushed through them. Beyond the wire lay miles of frozen marshland, the kind that could swallow a man whole. Hoover was herded into North Compound, Block 3, where the smell of damp straw and unwashed uniforms hit him. Inside, other Allied prisoners glanced up, appraising the newcomer with that hollow-eyed look of men who've seen too much. "New meat," one muttered, though his tone wasn't unkind. They all knew what it was like to arrive here, lost, cold, and wondering if you'd ever leave. Daily life in Stalag Luft I was a monotonous grind. Roll calls at dawn and dusk, thin soup ladled out in chipped tins, occasional parcels from the Red Cross, a godsend of powdered milk, canned meat, and, most precious of all, coffee. The guards were a mix of bored conscripts and stone-faced veterans. Some treated the prisoners indifferently. Others took a cruel pleasure in small humiliations, kicking over a pot of soup, confiscating a treasured photo, searching a bunk just to toss it apart. For Hoover, the hardest part wasn't the food, the cold, or even the cramped bunks. It was the waiting. He wasn't built to sit still. The war was raging beyond those fences, and he was stuck, a spectator to history. It didn't take long before Hoover started thinking about escape. Not in vague, daydreaming terms, but in plans. Concrete, detailed, risk-assessed plans. He talked quietly with other prisoners, especially those with experience in tunneling or disguise work. He noted which guards were lazy on night shifts, which towers had the widest blind spots, and when the spotlights swept over certain sections of fence. One thing was clear: an escape in deep winter was suicide. The marshes were impassable, and any open ground was blanketed in snow that would show footprints for miles. Spring or summer would offer the best chance. In March 1944, Hoover met Jerome Ennis, another down pilot with a wiry frame and a quiet, calculating manner. They shared a barrack and, over months, shared their thoughts about breaking out. Ennis had observed something interesting. The camp received regular deliveries of coal and supplies from German civilian drivers. Sometimes the guards were so focused on unloading that they didn't check the wagons as thoroughly when they left. "What if," Ennis whispered one night, "we didn't go over the fence?" But through the gate, the idea wasn't new in POW lore, but it was dangerous. If caught trying to stow away, punishment could mean solitary confinement, or worse, a bullet. Hoover smiled faintly. "I've done crazier things, Before attempting anything serious, Hoover and Ennis conducted small dry runs. They'd walk near the unloading areas, timing the guards' routines. They'd linger by coal piles to see if anyone noticed. One afternoon, Hoover intentionally dropped a spoon near a truck and took a moment too long to pick it up, watching how quickly the nearest sentry reacted. The guard only glanced, and then looked away. It wasn't much, but it was hope. In early April, a particularly chaotic delivery day gave them their opening. Two trucks arrived at once. One piled with firewood, the other with sacks of potatoes. The guards were split between them, shouting at each other over how to distribute the loads. Hoover caught Ennis's eye. This was the sort of distraction they'd been waiting for. But something held them back. The plane was good, but it wasn't ready. The countryside was still too cold, and they had no clear path once outside. They needed more than just the idea that changed everything. That night, under the dim light of a single bulb in their barracks, Hoover floated an idea so reckless it made Ennis sit back in disbelief. What if, Hoover began, we don't run on foot at all? What if we steal a plane? Ennis stared at him like he'd gone mad, but Hoover wasn't joking. He'd heard from another POW that a small Luftwaffe airfield lay somewhere west of the camp. If they could reach it, find a flyable aircraft, and get airborne, they might actually bypass the gauntlet of German patrols and make it to Allied lines. The obvious problems were staggering. They didn't know exactly where the airfield was. They had no German uniforms or proper identification. Hoover had never flown German aircraft types, but still, it was possible, and once the idea was out there, Hoover couldn't let it go. The next weeks became a careful balance between keeping up appearances and laying groundwork. Hoover listened intently to any guard or new prisoner who mentioned local geography. A few snippets of overheard talk confirmed the airfield's existence, though nobody knew exactly how well it was guarded. Meanwhile, Ennis worked on gathering supplies, stolen bits of bread, an old compass from a care package, even a crude map drawn from memory by another escaped but recaptured pilot. Each night, Hoover lay on his bunk, staring at the wooden ceiling, replaying every step in his mind. Out the gate, across the countryside, onto the airfield, into a plane. Up and gone before anyone could stop them. If they pulled it off, it would be one of the most audacious escapes of the war. If they failed, it would be their last. It was late April 1945, the war's final weeks. Though nobody inside Stalag Luft I knew exactly how close the end was. Rumors flew like moths around a lantern. Allied armies advancing in the west, the Soviets closing in from the east. But for Robert A. Hoover and Jerome Ennis, rumors didn't change the fact that they were still behind barbed wire. That morning, a low fog clung to the camp, muffling the crunch of boots during roll call. The guards were restless, distracted. Hoover had been watching them for days. He knew that guard rotations had shortened, discipline was slipping, and the once razor-sharp inspections at the gates were now done with half the care. It was time. The escape began with something deceptively simple, blending in with the daily routine. Hoover and Ennis positioned themselves near the main gate during a supply delivery. Two German trucks rolled in, one carrying firewood, the other filled with canvas-covered barrels. The drivers jumped out, barking in clipped voices as the guards moved to check manifests. The chaos was exactly what they needed. The pair sidled closer to the firewood truck, their jackets dusted with coal dust to mimic the camp's labor detail. When the guards turned their backs, Hoover gave a quick nod. Together they slipped behind the truck, crouching low as it rolled toward the gate again. As the truck rumbled through, they clung to the rear step. Hearts pounding, every second felt like a lifetime. The towers loomed above them, but no alarms sounded. The moment the truck cleared the last strand of wire, Hoover and Ennis dropped to the road and darted into the ditch, disappearing into the fog. Freedom, however, was a fragile thing. They were still deep in enemy territory, with miles to cover before they could even think about finding the rumored airfield. They moved quickly but cautiously, sticking to hedgerows and tree lines, avoiding villages where any passerby could turn them in. Hoover's pilot instincts, the same instincts that had saved him in the air, now guided them on the ground. He kept a mental compass of the sun's position, the wind direction, and the rough map burned into his mind from scraps of intelligence inside the camp. After hours of trekking, the distant rumble of engines caught his ear. Not the grinding treads of tanks or the clatter of trucks, but something smoother, sharper, aircraft. He crouched, scanning the horizon. Through the haze, just beyond a patchwork of fields, he saw it, the glint of a control tower, the thin line of a runway. The Luftwaffe airfield. Reaching the airfield perimeter was the easy part. Getting inside without being shot was another matter. A chain-link fence surrounded the grounds, dotted with guard posts, but luck, or fate, was on their side. Most of the guards seemed more interested in the sky than the ground, scanning for Allied bombers rather than prowling for intruders. The two men lay low in the grass, watching. A gap appeared when a pair of sentries wandered off toward the far side of the field. Hoover seized the moment. "Now," he whispered. They darted forward, slipping under the fence and into a row of half-buried hangars. Inside the first hangar sat a twin-engine Messerschmitt, too complicated, too much prep time. The second held a Focke-Wulf 190, sleek and deadly, but with its cowling removed for maintenance. The third hangar, however, revealed a gift, a Focke-Wulf 190, fueled, armed, and ready. Hoover's heart kicked in his chest. He had never flown one before, and certainly never without instruction, but he had studied German aircraft silhouettes during training, memorized cockpit layouts from intelligence photos, and understood that in the air, principles were principles. "Yeah," he said, eyes locked on the plane. "This is it." Ennis hesitated. The plan had been to escape together, but Hoover knew the 190 was a single-seater. There was no room for both. If they tried to steal a trainer or a transport, they'd risk wasting precious minutes. Minutes they didn't have. "I'll go," Hoover said. "I'll make it to the Allies and let them know you're here." Ennis looked at him like he was insane, and maybe he was, but finally nodded. "You'd better make it count." Hoover scrambled up the wing, sliding into the cramped cockpit. The smell of oil, leather, and cold metal was overwhelming. He scanned the instruments, fingers moving instinctively to magnetos, fuel mixture, throttle. The starter motor whined, the propeller coughed, and then, with a roar, the BMW radial engine came alive. The noise was deafening, and it was only a matter of seconds before every German on the base knew something was wrong. Hoover pushed the throttle forward. The fighter rolled, slowly at first, then faster, tires humming against the tarmac. A shout rang out somewhere behind him. A rifle cracked, the bullet, whining past, another shout, more urgent. But the 190's speed was building, and with a firm pull on the stick, the ground fell away. The airfield shrank beneath him. A dozen German soldiers scattered like ants, powerless to stop him now. Hoover had done it. He was in the air, flying an enemy warplane, behind enemy lines. But the hardest part was still ahead. Navigating hostile skies with no map, no radio contact, and no guarantee the Allies wouldn't mistake him for a target. The first minutes after takeoff were pure adrenaline. Robert Hoover gripped the control stick of the stolen Focke-Wulf 190 like it was the only thing keeping him alive, because it was. The fighter responded beautifully, slicing through the low clouds. Below him stretched the flat, scarred landscape of northern Germany, a patchwork of muddy fields and shattered villages. From the cockpit, Hoover could see columns of smoke rising where artillery duels still raged. Somewhere out there, the front lines snaked and shifted like a living thing, and he had no idea exactly where they were. Every second in the air carried a risk. If the Luftwaffe spotted him, they'd try to bring him down for stealing one of their own. If Allied fighters spotted him, they'd shoot first and ask questions later. Even farmers with rifles could be a threat if he went down in the wrong place. The FW-190's fuel gauge ticked lower. Hoover kept the throttle at a careful balance. Enough speed to stay hard to hit, but not enough to drain the tanks too quickly. He scanned the horizon for landmarks, rivers, roads, anything that matched the mental map he'd been building since the escape. He knew the safest route would be to follow the coast west toward the Netherlands, where he might cross into Allied-held territory. But first, he had to cross the invisible front line. The weather worked both for and against him. The low ceiling of gray cloud gave him cover from high-flying patrols, but it also hid the ground from view. He stayed low, sometimes no more than a few hundred feet above the fields, hoping the blur of terrain would make him harder to track. Then, through a gap in the mist, he saw it. It was a small detail, but to Hoover it was a beacon. Dutch windmills were common in the Netherlands, but rare in this part of Germany. If he was right, it meant he had crossed into territory recently taken by the Allies. Still, he didn't dare land on the first patch of open ground he saw. Too many fields were mined, too many safe airstrips could still be in German hands. Fuel was now dangerously low. Hoover scanned frantically for somewhere long and flat enough to bring the FW190 down without killing himself. Then he spotted it, an open stretch of pasture, green and level enough to try a belly landing. There would be no time for elegance. He cut the throttle, keeping the landing gear retracted to avoid digging into the soft ground. The fighter skimmed the grass for a heartbeat, then slammed down hard, skidding in a shower of dirt and torn turf. When the wreckage finally came to a stop, Hoover's ears rang, his hands trembled, but he was alive. Before he could climb out, figures appeared at the edge of the field, farmers armed with pitchforks and shovels, shouting in Dutch. To them, he was a German pilot who just crash-landed. They yanked him from the cockpit, ignoring his protests in English, and began marching him toward the nearest village. Hoover knew things could turn ugly fast. Angry civilians, memories of occupation. They wouldn't hesitate to deliver him to the wrong side. Then, luck intervened. A column of trucks came rattling down the village road. British markings, Hoover shouted, waving his arms. The farmers hesitated. Then one of the soldiers in the convoy caught his accent. A quick, chaotic exchange followed. Within minutes, the misunderstanding was over. The farmers backed off. A British corporal handed Hoover a spare greatcoat, clapping him on the shoulder. "You're safe now, mate," the soldier said, though he couldn't help adding, "Bloody hell, you flew here." Hoover was debriefed by Allied intelligence before being sent back to England. His escape, stealing an enemy fighter and flying it to freedom, became one of the most audacious POW breakouts of the war, but Hoover himself refused to romanticize it. "It was the dumbest thing I ever did," he later said with a laugh. "If I'd run out of fuel 5 minutes earlier, I'd have been back in a German cell." A week after his escape, Soviet forces liberated Stalag Luftwaffe, freeing the prisoners who had remained. Jerome Ennis survived and reunited with Hoover years later at one of Hoover's air shows. Every time they met, Ennis would shake his head at the memory. "Yeah, get in," Hoover would grin. "I'll give you a ride." And Ennis would always reply, "I told you, I never want to fly again." Hoover went on to become one of the world's most celebrated test pilots and aerobatic performers, flying everything from jet fighters to civilian prop planes with unmatched grace. He passed away in 2016 at the age of 94, a legend not just in the skies, but in the annals of wartime escape.